We're back. I'm Afshin Rattansi, and you're watching a new season of Going Underground, broadcasting from our studios in central London. Coming up in the show, as the Panama Papers claims its first Prime Minister, we go to Iceland to question the authority of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism, funded as it is by George Soros, the Ford Foundation and the Rockefellers. Plus, Europe begins its great cleansing of refugees as men, women and children are expelled to NATO-member Turkey, which stands accused of funding ISIS-Daesh.
Plus, from this week's headlines, we'll be reviewing the billion-pound bill for the Snooper's charter and the manufacturing meltdown for Steely Cam.
All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. A man, a plan, a canal, Panama, the longest palindrome in the English language. You can read that sentence out both ways, and it's the same. But that's not the same for the Panama Papers. Edward Snowden, the whistleblower who has taken refuge in Russia from the threat of American torture, called it the biggest leak in the history of data journalism. But the Panama Papers were read only one way by UK partners of the Washington-based International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which selectively disseminated the first revelations.
The documents from a law firm in Panama name close relatives of current and former Chinese leaders and associates of President Putin of Russia.
Yes, ICIJ affiliate the BBC that lost its Director General because of its opposition to the Iraq War used the millions of leaked documents to show support for David Cameron's policy on propagandizing against China and Russia. It was the same for The Guardian, and we all know how frightened of power The Guardian is.
I believe they have giant food mixer. Things like food mixers into which you can drop a computer, which would reduce.
So the food mixer was brought to the basement of the Guardian?
No, we did it with Black & Deckers.
That was an editor of The Guardian describing how the paper used its own Black & Decker drills to destroy Snowden information in the basement of his offices, witnessed by the head of David Cameron's civil service, along with men from GCHQ. No wonder The Guardian was keen to use Panama leaks that supported British policy against Russia and China, even though Vladimir Putin's and Xi Jinping's names are not even in the leaked documents. Cameron's is, incidentally, at least that of his father. And the two British media organisations that published Panama leaks, The Guardian and the BBC, have been keen cheerleaders for Islamists fighting Assad of Syria, so no surprise that they were less interested in Panama revelations against US-backed autocrats of the Middle East, let alone the NATO-backed leader of post-coup d'etat, Ukraine. But what will the IMF do about Ukraine if allegations against President Petro Poroshenko using the British Virgin Islands to evade taxes is true? The dodgy behaviour would have been at the same time that his NATO-backed troops were killing ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. Was the IMF boss aware of this when she was doling out billions in cash to Poroshenko?
I would observe that a coupon has been recently paid on that 3 billion that you're referring to. It is up to the board to determine the characterization of one bond or the other.
No doubt an urgent IMF inquiry is underway about whether billions have ended up in the British Virgin Islands. As for Britain's austerity-hit tax authorities, their response to the Panama Papers revelations about UK tax havens is to plead for more information, while the big four UK accounting firms laugh all the way to the bank. So, who or what is the ICIJ, or International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which got hold of the Panama Papers? We know it's funded by the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment, the Rockefellers, and George Soros, among others. It works with the Washington Post, owned by the founder of tax dodger Amazon.com. It also works with media organizations, including those of our next guest, Kristinn Hrafnsson. He normally wears his WikiLeaks hat on this program, but he's also a director and co-founder of the Icelandic Centre for Investigative Journalism, which has worked with the consortium. He joins me now via Skype from Reykjavik in Iceland. Kristinn, thanks for coming back on the show. You've worked with both WikiLeaks and the ICIJ, the other one, the famous one. What did you make of the consortium saying, the boss of it saying, that the consortium is not WikiLeaks? They are trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly by, in effect, not releasing all the Panama Papers.
Well, I mean, they're doing two things totally different from WikiLeaks. And just to clarify, I'm an advisor to the media partners in Iceland who are working with ICIJ on this huge story. And there are co-founders and friends within the Icelandic Centre for Investigative Journalism working on it. When they are saying that this is a responsible journalism, I totally disagree with the overall tone in that. I do have a sympathy towards sort of stalled releases. We certainly did that in WikiLeaks in 2010, 2011 on the diplomatic cables, and we were actually highly criticized for holding back the documents. But initially and in the end, the entire cache was put online on a searchable database. That is what I would want to see with these Panama Papers. They should be available to the general public in such a manner so everybody, not just the group of journalists working directly on the data, can search it. I do have an understanding that they can delay it for a certain time to maximize the impact, but in the end, it should be available to the general public. That's the new way. That's the way that WikiLeaks has presented, and it's highly appreciated by the general public.
Before we get to the specific murkiness of this leak, of course, there's no doubt it has done quite a lot of good. We are speaking to you in Reykjavik. Just tell me about the turbulence, political turbulence it's caused.
Well, I mean, it's massive. Demonstration in the center of Reykjavik with 20,000 plus people attending, demanding the immediate resignations of the government. I mean, this is huge. It's a small country, so if to put it into a context, we probably have about 10% of all voters in the country showing up on the main square in Reykjavik and saying, you know, get out of there. You have to resign. And it is basically two options on the table that the population has put in front of the government. It's resign or riots.
And your take on the resignation of the Icelandic leader?
Well, it was the only option on the table for the prime minister after such the biggest demonstration in the history of the country outside the House of Parliament, and after the Sunday the world could see where the prime minister blatantly lied and stumbled and basically walked out of the interview when confronted with the information that he had been associated with an offshore tax haven company. Now, there was no other option for the Prime Minister but to resign. He has caused an international embarrassment for Iceland, and the population of the country is absolutely furious. The only embarrassment in this context is that he didn't do it a lot earlier. Mind you, this embarrassing interview was taped 3 weeks earlier. But this was a logical conclusion and the only one that the people would have accepted. A total riot in Reykjavik could have resulted if he had tried to hold on to power.
Okay, now back to the consortium. They've kept it all secret, 11.4 million documents. Only they have decided what we've been able to see. Surprised that there are no big American names in the leaks so far? We have to speculate, obviously, because they may be releasing them later.
Well, to clarify, I don't have the access to the documents themselves, so I can't talk about what it entails. But some analysis of the general data might explain partly why there is sort of a bias in the reporting on these documents. It seems to be skewed toward, at least away from American interest. I saw somewhere that the companies in the tax havens, American companies, were only a third of the British companies in there. So I think there's always the possibility that it's not a journalistic bias, but simply a bias in the documents themselves and in the leak. You have to keep in mind that this is simply one law firm in Panama servicing and providing tax haven companies mostly out of the BVIs, the British Virgin Islands. So it doesn't even give the entire picture. I would speculate, for example, of knowing the Icelandic angle of it, that only less than a third of all the tax haven companies associated with Iceland are in these documents. And that's simply because only one of the main Icelandic banks were using this law firm in Panama for their services.
Let's just look at the possibility of journalistic bias, though. You've worked with mainstream media journalists, using them as a filter for data skewed this way or the other. Would you be trusting partners like the BBC and The Guardian to filter it for the public imagination?
That's a tricky question, and you know that, Afshin. WikiLeaks had a rocky relationship with a lot of the mainstream media, and were not particularly happy with how the information was being handled. The WikiLeaks revelations in many parts. There are also there, and I'm not trying to be apologetic against the journalists working on this, but there is a possible legal constraints in play as well. I mean, the libel laws in Britain are notoriously archaic and are a serious constraint on free journalism in Britain, for example. But there is also always the possibility of a journalistic bias that comes into play in working on such a huge leak. I saw that Craig Murray was discussing it on his website.
The former British ambassador.
The former British ambassador, which is a notable point, that how do you get information out of 11+ million documents? I mean, you have to start with some search criteria, and the search criteria reflects your interest. And so there's always a possibility that you are looking for information that will confirm some suspicions or some bias which you have internally.
What should potential whistleblowers watching this program, perhaps in British tax haven territories, learn from the Panama Papers when it comes to them leaking information on their employers?
Well, I mean, we discussed it. You know, my personal view is that information of this nature should be leaked to an organization that is determined and dedicated in making it available to the public, and that's WikiLeaks at the moment.
And just finally, should we be suspicious about the ICIJ because it gets its funding from the Ford Foundation, notorious foundation linked to covert CIA activity over decades, the Rockefeller Foundation? Should we be suspicious?
Well, Afshin, we should always be suspicious, and we should always check who is funding what when it comes to organizations and the media.
Kristinn Hrafnsson, thank you.
You're welcome.
After the break, as David Cameron's allies in Turkey are accused of burning and beheading hundreds of Kurds in Cizre, why the silence about the war crimes of a NATO member?
And from this week's headlines, we'll be fishing for facts about foreigners and giving chips to your dog.
All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. With me now is broadcaster and former Member of Parliament Lembit Opik to go through some of the week's stories, at least from the newspapers. Anyway, doctors are on strike today.
Oh yes, the evil doctors, ne'er-do-wells, only ever thinking about themselves. The government has dug themselves an enormous hole here. This is the coal miners' strike in hospitals. Not going to end very well for Jeremy Hunt and the rest of them, not least because the public are still behind the doctors. I think there may have to be a climb down here from the powers that be.
Let's go to your first headline from the only newspaper that realised Jeremy Corbyn would lead the opposition, Morning Star.
Yeah, interesting one. Morning Star says Tories refuse to save British steel. You could argue the Morning Star, which is a clearly left-wing paper, would say that, wouldn't they? But they're not the only ones. With maybe 40,000 jobs directly and indirectly at risk here, the government's got themselves into a hole. One which, by the way, Jeremy Corbyn can exploit. Only yesterday he was saying that 150,000 people had signed a petition for the government basically to do more to protect the steel industry. But what do? They're ideologically opposed to renationalising the industry. So they wring their hands and they say they're going to find somebody else to take it on. And they tell us all to buy British steel, even though the MOD and other state authorities are buying it in millions of pounds worth of quantities from abroad. Do as I say, not as I do.
And mainstream journalists are going, oh, well, the way to cover this story is to talk about billionaire Indians who will save the industry. No iota of understanding about the strategic nature of a steel industry at home. The Communist Party in China must be laughing at us.
Well, they've undercut not just the cost, the price of steel made here, also the strategic credibility of the British government.
Have they undercut it, really? Surely it's their subsidies to their own steel industry, their infrastructure.
But they're allowed to do that. And here's the irony. That clashes with the big Brexit debate. The Brexiters can now point at the British government and say, if we were outside the EU, then you could do this. Very hard to reply. So Cameron's in a really hot point here, and it's not the molten steel of Paul Talbot that's burning him. It's his own ideology coming up against the very real risk of an embarrassing climb down, either in terms of that ideology or letting tens of thousands of jobs go when he can least afford it.
Well, the next story, the Barclay Brothers Telegraph, I'm not sure which way they're voting at the June the 23rd referendum on Europe.
Well, once again, we're back to the referendum. The Telegraph says true scale of EU immigration to be revealed just weeks before the referendum. On the face of it, this is a weird story. It looks like the authorities will tell us the true figures we've never really seen before, of people coming into the country.
There are too many people coming in the country, we've got to get out of Europe.
But if that was the fact, why wouldn't they just bottle it up till after the 23rd of June? I think there's a very large political rat nibbling around the edges of this referendum now, because the government might think the figures are better than we expect. They might say, look, you didn't really have that much to worry about. But then I think, well, they got it wrong last year. There were triple the number of people coming into this country than David Cameron had promised. So as much as anything, these figures will reveal what they're playing at. But if the figures are bad, this can only help Brexit.
If it is deliberate manipulation, there will be another factor, of course, this whole EU-Turkey deal over refugees. And as summer approaches, no doubt we'll see humanity in at its most vulnerable on our TV screens. But let's go to this bizarre article from Evgeny Lebedev's online-only Independent.
Well, the Independent says, I'm from Palmyra and can tell you the Assad regime is no better than ISIS. This is a one-person survey of the entire situation in Syria. Even I wouldn't be confident to say that a one-person's eyewitness account gives us any real insight. Perhaps the facts are right, they're not corroborated, but really, is this what journalism has come to? An interesting personal testimony, a great blog, not convinced it's reliable enough to make a newspaper story. But what we do know is the whole thing's a mess. No more messy than the fact that the West supported one group who went on to be militants and then sort of seemed to be supporting Assad a little bit. We're on both sides and neither at once. I think that's the real underlying story here.
Well, you say it's a blog. David Cameron himself certainly probably feels the same way. I've seen no congratulations from him, either for the Syrian government, for the Russian government, for the Iranian government, for Hezbollah, for the PKK, in defeating ISIS. Perhaps Cameron does truly believe the Assad regime is worse than ISIS.
What's really interesting here, Cameron seems to have taken 5 sides and got it wrong each time.
Well, from your next story in the Mirror, at least David Cameron will be able to snoop around to see that you're not supporting ISIS sufficiently enough.
Well, the title from the Mirror, Theresa May's Snoopers Charter could cost taxpayers £1 billion just to get started. Based on Danish figures, and the Danish government have shelved their plans because of these statistics, it looks like it will cost over £1 billion just to store the data, not even to process it. That's crazy. At the same time, of course, from around now, you have to chip your dog, and you get fined hundreds of pounds if you don't. Maybe we should get them all to not chip their dogs, fine them all, and pay for storing the data. And hey-ho, the database would be full of criminals who didn't chip their dogs.
Putting chips inside dogs. I'd pay £1 billion to bug your phone and bug your email and check on your web browsing history. It's national security. See you next week, Lembit.
Maybe.
This week, NATO-patrolled Europe executed stage 1 of the EU-Turkey deal, mass deporting thousands of displaced men, women and children from Greece's barbed-wire detention camps. And as Turkey takes €3 billion to host Syrian refugees created after Ankara catalyzed ISIS-Daesh, reports are emerging of a silent genocide of the Kurdish people. But EU mainstream media turns the other way. As for David Cameron's ally, President Erdogan, he says he's not open to talks with the Kurds. Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is the director of the American Kurdish Information Network, Kani Xulam. Kani, thanks for joining us. So what will this EU deportation program mean for the Kurdish people?
The Turkish government has been attacking the Kurds since last August. 22 towns have been attacked their population comes to 1.6 million people. In the Kurdish areas of Turkey, there's literally a war, undeclared war. Towns like Sur, Nusaybin, Silopi, Yüksekova, Shirnak have been bombarded by tanks. People are subjected to lockdowns of 100 days, 90 days, 70 days without access to water. In any other part of the world, this would be a war, and it would be covered well, and it would be front page news. For some mysterious reasons, it's not being covered, and Turkey is being cuddled, and now is being asked to help the Syrian refugees, while it itself is generating Kurdish refugees.
Well, the tears of Federica Mogherini, the EU's foreign policy chief, were widely publicized after the Brussels attacks. As for on Turkey, she says she's opposed to a Kurdish state and has expressed sympathy for President Erdogan fighting the Kurds. What do you think of that?
Well, the Kurds are not going to ask Europeans when they should be free. No one should. People should be free. UN declaration says self-determination is a right. And while some nations have managed to live with their minorities, Turkey hasn't. Turkey has banned the Kurdish language since 1924, since its inception. Kurdish language is banned, Kurdish culture is banned, Kurdish political space is on a tight leash, or is very limited. And the Kurds want, more rights. They want local rights. They want local governance. And these are actually part of European conventions, part of European, the way that's how Europe runs its affairs.
So why are we not hearing in the press of NATO countries anything like you're talking about, any of the violence that you seem to be describing at the moment in Turkey?
I mean, I think some of it has to do with Turkey being a member of NATO. Some of it has to do with Europe needing Turkey to stop the flow of refugees. But
you're saying our free press, because Turkey's a member of NATO, isn't covering it?
For years, Turkey was viewed as a member of NATO and is a member of NATO now too. But when that friendship was forged, the NATO generals would meet. Let's say European generals would meet Turkish generals would meet American generals. They have had this, relationship, and now in the last 10 years, 12 years, this Islamist government has come to power. And while Europe is dealing with this government, it's not willing to expose Turkey in the way that it should be exposed.
Would you say there's a marked contrast there between the European Union and what's been happening between Washington and the Kurds? Obviously, the United States Air Force has been helping them in the fight against ISIS. There's been rapprochement between Washington and Moscow. Is Europe lagging behind Washington now when it comes to understanding the Turkish threat?
If there was no military base, if there was no Incirlik air base in Turkey, U.S. support for the Kurds would have been wholehearted. U.S. has to walk on a thin line, has to make use of the Incirlik air base in Turkey, and then it also knows that the Kurds on the ground are its most effective boots fighting ISIS. And it cannot criticize Turkey for imprisoning journalists, for declaring war on 22 towns in the Kurdish areas of Turkey. It has chosen not to. It has chosen not to address the Kurdish issue, and it's unfortunate.
Has Syria changed everything for the Kurds in that sense, that rapprochement between Moscow and Washington and the recognition that Turkey was buying oil from ISIS-Daesh, it has changed where the Kurds are at this moment in time?
Well, the Kurds of Syria are benefiting from these exposés of ISIS, Turkish collaboration. But the Kurds inside Turkey are suffering. The Kurds, the Russians have been supportive of the Kurdish aspirations in terms of federal entity inside Syria. Americans have not been so forthright, but I think they know that Syria cannot be put together. Syria is yesterday's news. Even if there's a future for Syria, it's going to be a fragmented Syria. It's going to be, it's not going to be an authoritarian Syria that the present leader used to enjoy or his father used to enjoy.
Is there a danger of reading too much into the fact that President Obama would not have a one-to-one meeting with President Erdogan, something that David Cameron here in London wouldn't even think of doing? Of course, the British Prime Minister would meet with the Turkish president. Too much to read in a seismic shift now within NATO about Turkey?
I think it has to do with this administration per se. Obama views Middle East as a lost cause. It just hasn't really gone his way. He hoped Israelis and Palestinians would reconcile on his watch. It didn't happen. With the onset of the Arab Spring, initially he was hopeful that the Middle East would take a turn for the good. With what happened in Libya and what's happening in Syria, he feels, it's better to stay out of it. And Europe received 1 million refugees, and there's no end in sight for the Syrian war. And now that Turkey is in turmoil, we might have even more refugees in Europe.
Some might say there is some kind of end in sight on the Syrian war. Do you think, as far as Europe is concerned, Turkey is just seen as a country that we can basically pay off 6 billion euros maybe as a dumping ground for refugees, migrants, whatever the latest word is for people fleeing persecution or looking for a better life?
You could say that Turkey has become a contractor, if you will, to stop these refugees, to give Europe a semblance of order that it has enjoyed since the Second World War, not to be disturbed with the overflow. In exchange, Turkey would be, given a green light, if you will, to be part of, so-called Europe, or part of that it wishes to be part of Europe. But inside Turkey, it doesn't really do things that it could be part of Europe. Rule of law has been suspended. Free press doesn't exist. There's a war against the Kurds.
What about the plight of Kurds fleeing what's going on, given the new EU-Turkey deal?
Even if you send back them to Turkey, you're not going to, when Turkey itself is not at peace with itself, you're not going to be able to stop these refugees. If Turkey was safe, then you wouldn't have, let's say Kurdish refugees adding themselves to the Syrian refugees.
Kani Xulam, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for today, but join us again on Saturday when we speak to leading English liberal philosopher Professor A.C. Grayling about whether the work of Galileo and Newton could navigate us towards peace in the Middle East. Get in touch via social media. Watch RT UK News with Bill Dodd on the hour from 7 till 10. We're back on Saturday, 24 years to the day that the CIA's man in Panama, Washington-backed Manuel Noriega, was sentenced to jail by a U.S. court, not for aiding torture and murder across Central America, but for money laundering and selling cocaine.